All right, 6 minutes after 10 o'clock. Thank you for tuning in this morning. Right there. You know, the music I use for our guests is Lindsey Buckingham. How many of you know that's Lindsey Buckingham? I use it for almost every guest, right? Lindsey Buckingham from Fleetwood Mac. And I don't think Lindsey Buckingham knows we use his music. I don't know. But anyway, when I would listen to Fleetwood Mac or so many groups in the course of my years, I've often thought, wow, they really were influenced by the Beatles, weren't they?
Yeah.
They really were influenced by the Beatles. I mean, how many times have I thought that about different groups? I've thought it about Billy Joel. I've thought it about you name them, and I've thought it about it. And then it could be the individual of the three primary songwriters of the Beatles. Ringo might have inspired some drummers. I imagine he did. I'm not trying to shortchange him on this discussion here. But as far as songwriting and music production, I think John Lennon, Paul McCartney, and George Harrison, those three, really probably influenced a lot of young musicians in the course of the years, and you can hear it. And it's not a bad thing. I mean, it's an inevitable thing. When there's great music, there's going to be somebody else who's going to be influenced by it, and then expand on it and maybe influence somebody else so that they eventually, the music changes over the course of years that way. Right. I guess that's my philosophy, my thought on it. Our next guest probably was inspired by the Beatles, probably was inspired by George Harrison, but it goes beyond that. And that's where his story becomes different from anybody else's that I've ever spoken to. He is David Young. He's on the phone, and he has made a name for himself as a singer-songwriter. He's, in fact, a Grammy-nominated singer and songwriter. He plays, it says, 2 Renaissance flutes in harmony simultaneously, so I'm guessing that's kind of like a sideshow thing, right?
Yeah.
That he does. That's kind of cool, though, to be able to do that. His songs have been heard on numerous TV shows. I was reading the list earlier, but I'll let him tell you. And he's written a book. Now, here's the fascinating part of this. The book is called Channeling Harrison, a true account of the ongoing and mind-blowing experiences between David Young and George Harrison. Channeling George Harrison. Book. It says book 1. David Young. Good morning, David. How you doing?
Well, good morning to you guys.
Where are you?
Well, right now I'm in Wilmington, Delaware, and I just got back from performing in New Jersey and upstate New York and in Pennsylvania.
Uh-huh.
But yes, I'm in Delaware. It's raining here today, but
yeah, I bet it is.
It's a bright day. Anytime I could tell this story, when you were just saying about the influence of the Beatles, the unique thing about it is that because I was born in 1961, I was a little bit too young to be a Beatles fan, and so I got, when I was a teenager, I was into hard rock music like Led Zeppelin and AC/DC and Bad Company, and so I wasn't a true Beatles fan. And the other two interesting things is that I didn't believe in channeling. I'd been meditating for 27 years when the experience started, but I didn't believe in channeling. I thought it was a joke. And the other thing was that I was afraid of ghosts.
Yeah, I don't blame you.
So when these experiences started, that I did not initiate, I just felt like I was the effect of these things, because these bizarre things with George started happening, and I didn't understand why, because I said I really wasn't a big Beatles fan. I mean, I love the Beatles song. Who doesn't love all the songs,
right.
Great songs that the Beatles wrote? But I didn't really feel a connection or an affinity with him at all.
Okay. So you were already a musician, though, right?
Yeah. I started playing the Renaissance flute when I was 7 years old. In third grade, like everybody else, I just kept playing it, and I got really good at it. And then when I was a teenager, I started to play guitar because nobody really needed a recorder player in their bands, And
Right.
so then I became a lead guitar player. I traveled all over the United States and Canada as a hard rock lead guitar player up until I ran out of money in 1990. Out of desperation in California, I started playing my recorder at Venice Beach. I met a woman who played the harp, We made a tape with my last $100 called Celestial Winds that we sold 10,000 copies of at
Wow.
Venice Beach.
Wow.
And that led to me selling over 1 million CDs of my relaxing instrumental music. The original CDs were called Celestial Winds. I sold 100,000 CDs under that name, and then when I went solo, when the harpist and I split up, then I sold 1 million CDs on my own.
And when was that? When were you on Venice Beach?
I was there from 1990 to 1992 on the weekends. They used to call us the Angels of Venice because it just felt like there was this bubble of love around us when we played, and tourists would stop, and actually the locals would always come on the weekends, and they would come back because they knew we were always there on Saturday and Sunday during the day. And so I used to wear this white puffy shirt every weekend at Venice Beach because Lisa had gotten me this puffy shirt at a place where all rock musicians buy all their clothing.
She was your girlfriend, right?
Well, she wasn't my girlfriend, but we worked together for 2 years, and
all right,
we were very close.
So the other day I was watching something, and it's just coincidental, maybe, or maybe not. Maybe I was being influenced by George Harrison. But I was watching this video, and it was Jeff Lynne and Donnie, George Harrison's son. They were talking about how, and it was an old video, obviously, because it's been a few years since they did this. But they were talking about how they took some unfinished music that George Harrison had recorded, some songs he had written and began, and they took this task upon themselves to finish the music that he didn't finish, that Donnie's father, George, hadn't finished. And they were talking about how they wanted to be fair to the music and not make it about them, but more about George and about his music. And about 2 or 3 songs into it, they felt like George was with them in the studio, and they both said it. They both said they felt that he was there, which, I mean, how can you deny somebody who says that? So how can I deny you, for example, when you say you've channeled him? And so that's why we're all ears. I want to hear about it. But I guess maybe there's a big question here that if a spirit who used to be a living human being can channel himself or herself through somebody who is still living, does that mean that you are the only one he is channeling through, or does he bop back and forth between you and somebody else?
Well, that's a great question. And first of all, I want to thank you for sharing what you just said to me about his son Danny and Jeff Lynne feeling like George was in the room with them. Because I haven't met Jeff Lynne or Danny yet, because my book doesn't actually come out until May 22nd. I mean, you can get copies of it on Amazon now, but it doesn't actually get to the bookstores till May 22nd. And, I'm going to be going to California in June, and, if the opportunity arises for me to meet Danny, who I'm really looking forward to meet, just knowing what you just told me would really be a real help for me, because I didn't know if Danny had experiences with his dad. So thank you for telling me that, number one. Number two, George has told me there are other people that he connects with. I think connecting is a nicer word in this aspect than channeling, just because it's such an interesting story, because the word channeling means that you open yourself up and this spirit can now talk through you.
Right.
My whole experience with this thing, at least the first 3 years of it, was not that. My experience was that he was doing these things in my life that were undeniable. Anybody who was with me could see them.
Like what things? Was it musical things or non-musical things?
No, non-musical things.
Like what?
Well, he appeared in my bedroom once. Well, that was kind of musical because he wrote a song with me, and you have to understand, I didn't believe in this stuff.
Okay. Okay. So I guess what I'm getting, okay, so it all started for you. You were meditating, and all of a sudden George Harrison was with you or something?
Okay, I'll explain what happened. So it was in 2010. I was ending a 9-year relationship where I adopted my ex's 2 kids, and we were a family. They grew up in my house. That ended, and I had been traveling 40 weekends a year for 20 years at that point. I had frequent flyer mileage on every airline, and because the economy was in such a terrible place, I had to move from Minneapolis, where I had been living for 9 years. The number 9 repeats everything in this whole experience. I lived in L.A. for 9 years before. I was living in Minneapolis. I had to move from Minneapolis back to the East Coast so I wouldn't have to fly to these shows, and I could just drive to the shows, okay? And so while I'm driving across the country, I was really falling apart because I just ended a 9-year relationship.
Yeah.
And so I had this pile of CDs that was next to me. The CDs were not in the cases. It was just the raw CDs. And I said to God, pick me a good one, something that's going to make me feel better. And so out of my 1 out of 50 chance, because there were like 50 CDs there, I randomly picked out Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, and I thought, Lonely Hearts Club Band, that sure is appropriate for me right now.
Okay.
And so I put that, yeah, it's kind of funny. So I put that in my CD player, and when I got to George's song, Within You Without You, that starts with the sitar, has all those Indian instruments, there was something about it that just brought me peace. And so for the following 3 hours, I hit repeat. After every time the song was over, I played it again. And I did this for 3 weeks because I had to stop in Chicago for 2 weeks of gigs until I got to the East Coast. I get to the East Coast finally, and I go visit a friend that I haven't seen in 25 years.
Right.
And I get to this guy's house, and sitting on his television set was a DVD of the concert for Bangladesh, which was the concert that George put on. And I thought, this is weird. I've been listening to that song for 2-3 hours a day now for 3 weeks. I wonder if there's a connection.
Huh.
Well, the very next day, I carpooled for the first time in 20 years of doing 40 shows a year. I decided to carpool with this other artist an hour and a half south of me in Princeton, New Jersey, to Baltimore. And I get to this guy's van. I put my CDs, my flutes, my clothes in the back of his van. I sit down in the passenger seat, and sitting on the dashboard is a cassette tape of the concert for Bangladesh. This is 24 hours after it popped up in this friend's house I hadn't seen in 25 years the day before. And I was freaked out because this is weird, And I said, what is this thing doing here? He said, well, I went to the concert for Bangladesh in 1971. I bought 2 tickets for $3.50 each, and the 2 ticket stubs in this CD have been in a box in my attic for the last 28 years, or however many years it was.
Right.
And I took this cassette tape out this morning to listen to on the drive. That's pretty weird. Don't you think that's weird?
That is weird. Yeah. My story of the concert for Bangladesh is I wanted to. Of course, I was a little bit too young. I lived on Long Island. I knew about it and couldn't go, of course. But I waited for it when it was released as a record. There was a radio disc jockey at the time. I don't even want to try to remember his name, but he had one of those shows where late at night he could play full albums, and so he promised he was going to play the full album, and he did. And I remember waiting up late at night, just listening to, I think it was WPLJ, some New York City radio.
Yeah, I
station.
remember WPLJ. I remember that. I grew up in Brooklyn.
Yeah. So, and I can't remember who the host was, but he played it. Okay, so.
So that was the first thing. That started in 2010, and then 3 months went by and nothing happened. And I decided to move down close to Philadelphia near a place called New Hope, Pennsylvania. And my friend introduced me to this woman, and I was on my 3rd date with her. She asked me what the highlight of my career was, and I said it was when Paul McCartney started a standing ovation for me in 1999. And then she said, well, did you know that George Harrison used to babysit me when I was a kid?
Oh, wow.
Well, I said, what do you mean? She said, well, my mom and George went to the same yoga ashram in Tucson, Arizona, and that's where the Beatles used to vacation. And when my mom and my biological dad split up, she and George started dating, and after a couple of months they fell in love, and then he moved me and my mom to England, and I grew up in this big castle.
Oh, wow. Oh, wow.
Yeah. So pretty much it pretty much never stopped once that happened. I dated her for a couple of months, and
so tell me about the standing ovation. That's an interesting story right there. What happened? What happened there?
Well, there's a long story and a short story. I'll try to tell you the shortest version of it that I could. But I was hired to play at this event for his daughter Heather, because she's a designer. He has one daughter who designs clothes, another designer who designs gifts and, you know, different cool things for the house, like rugs and pottery and stuff. And so his wife Linda had passed away 6 months earlier, and so he came to help show support for Heather and her work, and it was his first public appearance in 6 months because, you know, he was grieving the loss of his wife. And
right.
so he came. I was playing at the event. He loved it. He just.
So you finished the song. What song did you finish when he stood up and started applauding?
Well, it was at the end of the whole event, because I had been playing at this event while they came into the room. I think there were about 200 people in this room. It was a press conference, you know, and so when the press conference ended, he just came over to where I was, and he just told me he thought I was great, and, you know, it was a high point in my life, you know. I mean, and you know, the weird thing about it, the weirdest thing of everything was that when he walked into the room, the friendship the warmth that he gave to me, it felt like we'd known each other forever. It wasn't like there's a stranger on the other side of the room. There was no way that he could have been more welcoming and happy that I was there. He smiled at me and made eye contact with me, you know, for a long, long time.
Huh.
And it was so unique because I didn't expect that. That really caught me by surprise. But basically, one of the things that George has explained to me is there are these things called soul groups. And a soul group, I'm not talking about Motown.
Right.
That was a joke. Okay, sorry.
Got it.
But a soul group is different souls who reincarnate together over different lifetimes. And because there's this love, there's this bond that you have from the previous lifetime, when you meet with these people, it might feel like it's the first time you're meeting physically, but you've actually had a connection with them in another lifetime, and it's called a soul group, you know. And so George explained to me, after about 3 years, and once I started getting better at understanding it and better at hearing it, and after he got me this publishing deal, you know, from heaven, he got me a publishing deal.
Right. Okay.
Which is a whole story in itself. But he explained to me that, you know, when I met Paul, the reason why there was that instant connection between he and I was because Paul and George and John Lennon and I are in the same soul group.
What happened to Ringo?
So, well,
he's a rogue.
You know, Ringo was, I in my personal opinion, even though when I was much younger, Ringo was kind of my favorite because he had this funny way about him. You know, I like people who make me laugh, and there was something about Ringo.
Yeah,
he always think, you know, that made me laugh. But like you were saying when you started this thing, I think that there's two parts of the Beatles. There's the songwriting aspect of the Beatles because their songs are like part of our life. You know, they are part of life on Earth.
David, let me
part
just
of life in heaven as well.
Let me interject this, because if they're all part of a soul group, as you say, then George Martin must be part of that group as well, because the music that we consider Beatles music is clearly Billy Preston, George Martin, and some others who became really part of the Beatles without most people really realizing it. And have you met with George Martin? you might want to.
No, this is all. I haven't met with George Martin yet because my book hasn't come out, and the publicity is starting for the book. Basically, you know, it started a couple of days ago. Where you know, I'm doing interviews all the time with this, and you know, you made a really good point. And one of the things that George has been teaching me, it's about being part of a team. Because I've been a solo artist now for like 25 years. I've recorded 55 different albums. I'm the artist. I'm the producer. I hire the musicians, and I'm in charge of my recordings, you know, where the Beatles were a partnership. And so not only were they a partnership between like the three main songwriters and you know, Ringo being their support musician, and total best friend and buddy and everything. But there was a partnership between the four of them and George Martin, and later on with Billy Preston when he started playing keyboards with them. But it was a team effort, which is something that I have not been used to because I've been a solo artist.
Do you know Billy?
There's a lot of
just so you know, Billy Preston was with the Beatles when Billy Preston used to play with Little Richard in Hamburg, Germany, in 1961, the year you were born. When Billy Preston was when the Beatles were there, when they were, well, actually before that even. So the Beatles knew Billy Preston before they were all famous. And later on, when the Beatles became famous, Billy Preston, being an American, went over to England at the invitation of George, as a matter of fact. And the only four people he knew in all of London were the four most famous people there, aside from royalty, which was the Beatles. The only four people he really knew were the Beatles. And George Harrison said, why don't we do a record together? And if you listen to That's the Way God Planned It by Billy Preston, you can hear that it's the same chord progression as Let It Be. He clearly was inspired by that song. And George Harrison said, why don't we do a record? I'll get some of my friends and we'll record. So he took them to Apple Studios. George Harrison took Billy Preston to Apple Studios. Billy Preston not knowing anybody except for these guys that the whole world knew. Yeah. And suddenly Ginger Rogers was on the drums. Eric Clapton was playing guitar. He looked around himself and he saw all these familiar faces that are legendary in the music world because they were all friends of George.
Yeah.
So I think you're right. I mean, it was a huge team that George was a part of. He had a huge support network that went beyond the four faces you saw on the cover of their albums.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, absolutely. And did you ever hear the story about that? After the Beatles opened up for Little Richard, their manager, Brian Epstein, asked Little Richard to take the Beatles to America. And he said, if you take the Beatles to America, because they were pretty much unknown at that point, Brian Epstein said that he would give Little Richard 50% ownership of the Beatles. And Little Richard turned him down.
Huh, I hadn't heard that one. No. Yeah. There's so many stories.
And when you hear the Beatles... whenever they would do that falsetto singing,
yeah.
The way they learned it, Little Richard taught him how to do that backstage because they were always interested in the way he did that because it was like a fun, exciting thing.
Well,
whenever Little Richard would sing like that,
and anybody who knows both artists could see that. It's kind of like saying it's easy to see that Oasis love the Beatles. It was clear to see that the Beatles loved Little Richard.
Yeah, for sure.
And
absolutely.
Well, I'm loving this conversation, David. I'm so fascinated by the fact that George Harrison channels himself through you. That's kind of cool. The book is called Channeling Harrison. It's not in stores yet, but it will be later on in May. It's written by David Young. Can we get it right now online?
Yeah, you can get it on Amazon, or you can go to my website, davidyoungmusic.com, get an advanced copy of it. And it's called Book One because my publisher had to put a cutoff date about 5 months ago, so this way it would be manufactured and in the stores in time. And so all the things that were happening, because as soon as the publishing deal came into effect, the stories, if they were happening once a month, the stories started happening like 3 times a day or 5 times a day. It's really an amazing experience.
Well,
but one of the things that I do want to share, because I know we got
David, I got 10 seconds though. I'm just out of time, David. I apologize. I wish I could have allowed you to say more. Do this for me. Tell George thank you, because I think I have loved his music. I never got to thank him for it. Although I did see him live in Atlanta one time.
Right.
David, fascinating. I apologize for having to cut off. We've got to go to Fox News. Thank you so much for being on with us today.
Oh, my pleasure.
And you're welcome back anytime. You're welcome back. We will take a little break. Fox News coming right up.
Fox News Radio, I'm Lillian Wu. We've just gotten disappointing numbers out on the GDP.
The economy grew just 0.1% in the first 3 months of the year. Not only is that below expectations, but it is a major decline from the 2.6% growth rate in the fourth quarter.
Fox